Thanks, the BDS, to talk about this book, which is a global synthesis, not only of dragonfly conservation, but their role in freshwater conservation, because the two are entwined. In fact, the fate of humans and dragonflies are entwined, with stresses on the one hand and opportunity on the other. Now, intrinsic value, we all love dragonflies. Quite interesting in conservation, the whole debate around intrinsic value, which the last century was really in favor in the beginning of this century. But then in 2009, there was quite a switch in conservation authorities to saying, no, it's not something that we can do conservation action on. But more on that later. Now, let's have a look globally at dragonflies, most are least concern, and only one is formally declared as extinct. That's the Sentinel data. But there are 19 species critically endangered, possibly extinct. But interesting, they're doing better than other aquatic groups. But of concern globally are the narrow-range endemics, and there are two here that really need protection. Now, as Roy mentioned, it's about the habitats as well as the species themselves. And in fact, Norman Moore said this in the first action plan. Norman Moore, who lived in Cambridgeshire, dedicated dragonfly conservationists of bygone times. Now, as we've seen in some of the previous talks, high-value artificial habitats have a great value. Now, let's just look at a couple of curious things. We know they're amphibiotic, and so we're talking about the land as well as the water. And we're all quite familiar with the Carboniferous giants, but interestingly, there were many proto-damselflies, which were quite tiny at the time. And if we look at it today, we have a similar situation. This Anax parata, for example, here in South Africa, will be flying over the tiny Agronemus ruberina. But we even have some giants today, as Anax, for example. In fact, when you see it flying, it actually looks like a martin or a swallow. And you try to catch it, and by golly, you don't have a second chance. It flies straight up into the sky and out of sight. Can you believe it? And he embeds a picture of the huge Petalura from Australia, the larva, which lives in a burrow. Let's just remind ourselves of of dragonflies and their literally millions of years of evolution and their visual recognition for habitat rivals, prey and predators. Now, we know the dorsal zone is well developed for locating position of prey in the sky. The visual field's almost spherical except behind the head, as all dragonfly collectors know. Can detect plain and polarized light and colors even in dim light. I've actually caught an Anax parata in virtually pitch black with only a quarter moon, but I could hear it flying up and down over a little wooden bridge, and I managed to catch it. I couldn't believe it. You think of it normally being a diurnal species. And interestingly, dragonflies have many light opsin genes, in fact, more than in invertebrates, and an extremely high level of neural integrations. And of course, as we all know, they've got thousands of ommatidia. And it's a well-honed flying machine. The effective chemico-structured wing components and muscle power, flexible abdomen for maneuverability, efficient flexible wing design and articulation, and head and body move independently. And of course, the accurately timed phasing and positioning of the fore and the hind wings. And probably the most naturally widely spread invertebrate in the world is possibly Pantala flavescens. And here is where it's been recorded, the northern range up there, right across the Americas to eastern Russia and Japan, and in the south, the Cape Floristic region, somewhat even on Amsterdam Island, and is the only species that is resident on Easter Island. And it has, like the monarch butterfly, intergenerational migration between East Africa, Central Europe, and across the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean islands. And here we have the helicopter damselfly of Central America. And any of you that have seen it, it's remarkable how it moves backwards and forwards, ups and down, and it can pick spiders off their webs. But of course, we talk about the adult, but we mustn't forget the larva, which arguably has many life forms, probably more greatly in the adult. Particularly if you see at the top right here, there's a few gomphids from our part of the world. And some of them are real specialists. Here's Bednopagia cornuta. And you can see its long wings, big abdomen, but a big thorax, but tiny abdomen. It's a darts around. It's very powerful flyer. It doesn't fly far, but flies very fast. And it breeds in these rock pools in savanna rivers. And here's a tank bromeliad specialist from South America, which feeds on mosquito larvae. Now, we're well aware that dragonflies occur across the world, except where there's the permanent ice. And there are many island endemics. I'd like to just draw attention to Megalagrion, which are 24 species. It's thought to be it's a sweepstakes effect, and an ancestor arrived about 10 million years ago and diversified. And there's extreme specialization in microhabitats among them. And some of them, of course, are highly threatened, about half a dozen of them, actually. And if we now look at Sky Islands, the Cape Floristic region is very mountainous. And if we look at richness, species richness, log area across the Western Indian Ocean, it's a typical species area slope. And notice that grey palette-shaped area, which is all the Seychelles. The granitic islands are above the curve, but the coralline islands, including Chagos, like Aldabra and so on, are below the line. Now, the Sky Islands fall along that line, a little bit above the line, so they're a little bit richer, which is not surprising as it's part of a continent. But the Cape Peninsula is offset because that is a peninsula and it's a peninsular effect. And some of the endemics here are incredibly ancient. Here are a couple of the Cincordulia. And with our DNA work we've done with Jessica Ware, Gracilis is the oldest. 59 million years or so ago, it became a species. And they're all very ancient, the endemics here. Now, we talk about mapping and movements, but in this case, Asiagrion dondoensis was not recorded present in South Africa up on the eastern coast there. It was only known from Mozambique, despite that upper area being very well explored. But then there was a huge cyclone in the year 2000, and the species turned up in South Africa in the year 2000 following the cyclone, and it became, at a couple of sites, the most dominant species. And then the dry phase of El Nino came in and it disappeared in 2006, and it's not been recorded since. So possibly that's passive flight going along with weather conditions. In fact, that little Agronemus ruberina I mentioned, and a couple of other Agronemus, when a new pond is constructed, they seem to appear out of nowhere, even though they're so tiny. So presumably they go up out of the boundary layer and disperse. Then, of course, we've got the neonatives, the range-expanding species. Crocothymus erythrea was first seen in gravel pits in Germany a few years ago, and then spread to natural habitats. And of course, it's a vagrant in the UK, but as far as I understand it, it hasn't been recorded as a resident yet, but it will almost certainly become a resident in due course. It's a very resourceful species. Now, when we're talking about conservation, we also need to know a bit of background. I just give a little bit and the importance of past glacial events. And if we look along the Appalachians, for example, at the bottom there, a generator of diversity, Montaigne was just below the glaciers. And then we've got warm, wet refugia in central America, and on the other side in Japan and Southeast Asia. And then obviously seas transgressions and mountains have acted as barriers. And then of the Atlas Mountains, there are a high number of endemics. And then Central Europe, there's a mixing of different origins. And in the Balkans and Greece, that area is an important center of post-glacial colonization. We return to Southern Africa. Historical factors have played a major role because there's been no glaciations for over 200 million years. And the oceanographic and topographical patterns have played a very important role. We have the warmer Gullis current coming down from the tropics and the cold Benguela current going up. And that's led to high species richness up in the northeast, but high species endemism down in the Cape area, in the mountainous area. And the current and future factors of topography, annual rainfall, average temperature, solar radiation, and soil type, which is related to drain rate. Now, if we look at traits, which of course are biological characteristics of individuals, populations, species that determine dragonflies' responses to environmental change, including interaction with other organisms, for better or worse, according to those traits. Now, a dragonfly is an open system with energy flow in and out like all living organisms. And that's determined by surrounding biotic and abiotic variables. Inside the body, there's biochemical and physiological interactions, symbionts, and parasites. There's also external parasites. So in deep time, that has led to evolution, phylogenetic restraints. And now in modern times, the traits have been honed according to modern conditions relative to current natural and sexual selection. And obviously depends on genetic diversity and genetic plasticity. And these genetic, morphological, physiological, and behavioral capabilities determine how the species is going to survive in a changing world. Now, if we look at narrow range endemics on the left and wide range species on the right here, the narrow range species, habitat specialism is high, low in the wide, breeding season duration is low, breeding season duration is long in the wide. That interacts with dispersal ability and low dispersal ability, high level of phylogenetic restraints, but the widespread species, wide dispersal ability, but low level of phylogenetic constraints. But there's a big difference between dispersal and mobility because some of the narrow range endemics like that Cinquejulia I showed earlier, they are highly mobile, but they're not very dispersive. A lot of interesting work has been coming out on parasitism, and we know it reduces genetic diversity and stress and comprises immunity, which can be accumulative across life stages. Viruses now are known to circulate more widely than previously thought. There's microsporidia. There are helminths, the gregorines, of course, which are very well-known parasites and often related to stress and reduced output, lower fat content, and so on. And then there are mites and which can be very common in some localities. And then, of course, parasitoids, which that can parasitoise the eggs in plant material and under the water. Now, if we look at some of the stressors, which we're all familiar with, but there's sediment and heavy metals, runoff causing algal blooms. And then, of course, in the terrestrial environment, we have various forms of land transformation and intensity. But the point here, often these stresses can be interactive and may vary in nature over time. And I really want to emphasize this because adversely synergistic effects, you have, for example, climate change, landscape change, and pollution. And then we measure the traits. But a lot of the traits we don't know about. We talk about traits and traits we're familiar with, but just give an unknown trait response will be, for example, gut symbionts in response to environmental change. Now, I want to draw attention to forest canopy loss, which maybe is not particularly significant in the UK, but it certainly is in many parts of the world, and particularly in the warmer parts of the world. And of course, it leads to degradation, and often it's followed by conversion to agriculture and plantations as well as mining. The problem is there's changes in light and other physicochemical conditions, and the change in status of vegetation and organic matter. And what the change in dragonfly assemblages is a loss of mostly habitat specialists and a shift to more homogenized assemblages. In other words, the light-loving, more generalist species tend to replace the forest specialists. Now, there's a lot of interesting work coming out, particularly out of Europe, particularly Robbie Stock's lab, on pesticide type. And it's about concentration, pesticide concentration, environmental temperature, and which is related to food availability, habitat quality, other pollutants and contaminants. So we have physiological, behavioral, and developmental changes like different food intake levels, survival rate, energy levels, immune response, predator-prey interactions. But very interestingly, carryover effects, sometimes from the larva to the adult. And one study has shown some urban populations might be adapting more than rural populations. Populations of the same species, but at different latitudes, may have different responses to the warming. But maybe that may be moderated by novel stressors. Now, runoff effects, again, we're learning much more about this across the world, and we know it can directly affect biochemistry, physiology, behavior, and ecology, but it can also have indirect effects via extra growth of algae and macrophytes. And often those runoff associated with bioaccumulation, pharmaceuticals, nanoplastics, plastic debris, dump building materials, detergents. And obviously there's warmer water and oxygen depletion. Again, the overall outcome seems to be an impoverished and homogenized dragonfly assemblage. Now, we've been hearing about standing water loss in 1700, which has been since in 1700 high in Europe, North America, definitely exacerbated by droughts, as Scott was saying, and changes in physicochemical conditions. Now, in some parts of the world, this loss is being offset to some extent through rainfall events and in the Alps through the melting glaciers. Peatlands, of course, again, this is we heard about earlier, is a great concern, even though it's a very small percentage of the global land area. And it's not just the loss of the peat, it's loss of functional connectivity. I just want to mention extension debt as another sort of crucial factor we should consider. Like just for example, excessive nitrogen and phosphorus, there could be a time delay, impact on one population, but we're not really noticing it because it's not easily measured on a wide scale. And then there's more impact on what other populations leading to extinction. And that extinction debt, the type of impact and speed of impact can vary around the world, and this is tricky. We can't we don't have one rule that fits all. And the point is, while species richness may remain the same, species composition can change. So ideally, we want early detection followed by rehabilitation or restoration. Now, let's just mention aliens quickly. Alien aquatic plants could be a major problem. Dam construction, hydroelectric dams, as we know, are devastating. But in some parts of the world, including our part of the world, some of the dams, when they get invaded by macrophytes, there can be a population increase of some species. Alien trees are a major, well, I'll come to that in a moment, shading out sunny habitats. Alien fish, which is the main problem for those Hawaiian megalagrian. Alien frogs, it's thought that it's an alien frog caused the Sentinel darter to become extinct. Alien crayfish, as we heard this morning, causing a reduction in abundance, and alien mussels can reduce survivorship and mobility. I just mentioned this because it's quite a curious factor. The fire is quite common in southern Africa, and as I mentioned, a lot of the local dragonflies are quite powerful flyers, but poor dispersers, and they forage on the hilltops, and they smell the fire is approaching, or at least detect it. Let's be scientific. And so you get the forage area burnt. Now, the vegetation is well adapted, but so are the dragonflies. But they know the difference between a fire non-refuge, that middle picture on the right there, which got burnt. But in other areas, there are refuges, and here at the bottom, riparian unburned refuge with trees intact, riparian unburned refuge with low vegetation intact. And what happens, the adults, when there is a fire, they go into these refuges. And if the fire is early in the year and they're still in the larval stage, and a lot of these Cape endemics are quite late season, and that might be partly selection to emerge as the fire season is passing. And let's have a look at conservation action. We've looked at some of the issues. We haven't covered all of them, but there are a few of them in the top picture there. And then we aim to improve things in various ways, improving obviously the water type of farming we use, beaver reintroduction, which has been quite successful in Europe, and reforestation and so on. Now, I'll just show you some of the work we've been doing is uh, putting in place large-scale conservation corridors in the form of networks. And these are huge. They cover literally thousands of hectares. The dark green there on the left, plantations of alien trees. And the light green is the indigenous grassland vegetation, mostly grassland, some forests and so on, with ponds and a river. And we can model this using graph theory to look at functional connectivity. In practice, this is what they look like. At the top here, top left, this is in the with plantation forestry pine. These are pine trees that are alien, but these very large corridors are left to allow the corridor to flow through. It's coming down that hill around the corner here, and then marshland at the top right there. And here you can see a plantation, and that's an artificial pond on the far left there. which is very rich in species, and this wetland in the front, which actually is an artificial wetland. And on the bottom right there are hippos, which are also conserved. Large mammals are also concerned. The hippos have a very important role to play in stirring up the waterweed, keeping the waterweed down, and they make channels on the riparian zone, which improves dragonfly conservation. In our part of the world, I just want to mention biosphere reserves. They're playing a major role. There's something like 740 now around the world. They have a core zone where it's total protection, a buffer zone which protects the core with only strict agroecology transition, with mostly agroecology, but some conventional agriculture. And I just mentioned 4 here in the Cape. And on the far right here is a narrow range endemic Echlorolestes niletha, which occurs in the Biosphere Reserve. And it needs deep forest, one of the few species we have that's a deep forest species. And this in the middle top there, Echlorolestes peringai, very curious. It's very camouflaged. In fact, this picture is brightened because in the field, you can really only spot it by its shadow rather than the species itself. That occurs in the Kuckelberg, it's pronounced Kuckelberg biosphere at the bottom there. This is a very curious biosphere reserve. It's got 38 species, but 6 of them are Cape Floristic region endemics and 5 are national endemics. And then there's the threatened species. But what is interesting, this is the value of biosphere reserve, the total abundance of these rarities are more than that of the remaining widespread species. It's quite counterintuitive. I just want to mention, this is Keith Walton's data. Hong Kong was virtually deforested by the year 1870, mostly for shipbuilding, but also fire burning and so on. Today it's been revegetated. That's secondary forest there in the picture in the middle. And if you look, take the dark green bars, you can see the cumulative number of species, how they've recovered over the years. Now, one thing is very clear in virtually every part of the world is the critical role that aquatic macroites play in aquatic food webs. I won't go into the detail, but it depends on species of dragonfly relative to some of the type of macrophytes, density of macrophytes. But I just mentioned there are other aspects as well. This Pachycypher caligata, it needs logs in the water. It ovipods, it perches on logs, as you can see there, male and a female, and the female lays the eggs in logs in the water. Now, we are well aware, of course, of the importance of the riparian zone, but you know some species, of course, need the transform of, but let's put it another way around. They need the terrestrial matrix beyond the riparian zone. Whether to mature or to forage. Some species are very good at this, but this is a filter, this outside area. Sometimes if it's too transformed, then it can really inhibit some species. So often we need to think far more beyond the riparian zone. Invasive alien species, that blue curve is actually where the river is. Now, naturally, that would be sclerophyllous fame-bossed vegetation, and very important for narrow range endemics in the Cape Floristic region. But it's totally blocked out by acacia trees. And removal of these alien trees has been really important. This is the case of the top of Table Mountain in Cape Town. Pine trees were chopped down. They were causing the water to dry out. And then when it's left to recover, as in the bottom left here, we've got incredible recovery using the Dragonfly Biotic Index, which is composed of 3 components: the geographical distribution of a species, its red list status, and its habitat specificity. And in this case, the index went from 10 to 60. Now, in the savanna, because there are more widespread species, there's an increase, but then they weren't so initially affected by aliens. But when it comes to dragonfly recovery score, in other words, the percentage recovery, on the top of Table Mountain, it was 600% dragonfly recovery score. In the savannah, it's 114. Obviously, 100 would be the same. So removing alien trees can be really effective. And we have in South Africa a large national program devoted to removal. It's called the Working for Water, and it's devoted to removing alien trees along waterways. Now, we've also found that some of the narrow range endemics use alternative habitats in the times of drought. Because these habitats, in fact, these two pictures are taken in a botanical garden. And artificial reservoirs, they can play a very important role. And this Africolagma sapharinum is a South African endemic. I've only ever found it once in a fully natural situation. But if you want to go and see it, without fail, you can go, for example, to this reservoir, and it's around the edges on these long sedges and grasses. And here's some well-restored ponds in reserve areas in Croatia, which are very attractive to dragonflies. In Czechia, these seemingly insignificant streams are good habitats for Synagogue ornatum. Some species are not only tolerant, they seem to like disturbed areas that are disturbed by mega herbivores, that although they would seem to be a big disturbance factor, they really pound the water, and you can see where the elephants enter there. They really stir things up. But some species, these two, which are fairly common species, but they really benefit from that sort of activity. Now, reintroductions, I appreciate there's been some great work done in the UK, particularly by Dave Thompson with Mucuriali, but I just mentioned it's not been done in our part of the world, and not as I'm aware, much elsewhere either. But in Algeria, Eurythema said wardseye was reintroduced. It's not a rare species across Africa. It's now, I think, turned up in Sicily. But it was going extinct in Algeria, and they found that reintroduction of larvae there has been very effective in restoring its populations. Now, we heard from Roy about outreach and the importance of dragonfly trails. And here we have one of our trails. This is a dragonfly map. If you look at those little yellow dragonflies, that's the trail. And there's Kingfisher Lake there, which is actually a small reservoir. And that was a result of a very small impoundment to back up the water a little bit and to make, so this trail has about 40 species in it overall. And we did an identification guide to encourage, because people that go to botanical gardens, we found they're generally very interested in dragonflies. Now, we've done 32 years of management on that site. The historic state was the stream. The impoundment was put in, as mentioned, it's only tiny. And within that impoundment area, we only lost one species, the Gomphid cognatus, but it was still on either side of the pond. And then it started to infill. And then there's re-establishment later. If we look at the graph at the bottom, the impoundment in those sites along that particular, around that lake, the species was about 12. And after that, it went up to about 22, 23. But then the years passed and dredging was required. And just before dredging, we did an assessment, and the levels were even lower than before the impoundment was put in place. Then after that time, there was dredging, removal of invasive alien plants, and planting of indigenous marginal vegetation. And that sloping line with the arrow there is showing ecological succession and an increase in microhabitat heterogeneity. Now, freshwater assessment and monitoring, I just want to emphasize, because sometimes there's confusion, assessment is the state and or status of something. Monitoring is changes in the state or status of something over time. Now, this is obviously, both of them are really important if we're looking at how things are declining or how they're increasing. But we've got to be very careful what we're using as our control, if you like, or reference line, because there may have been a shifting baseline. In other words, there could have been loss of habitat specialists already. So we need to be careful of that when we're doing restoration, because we notice that sometimes we've done restoration, we've got things have come back, and then we thought, oh my goodness, they were in the area, but they had been lost a long time ago, but they're now coming in because they're in the natural area. And we found actually, earlier in the day, we were talking about dispersal. We found when we've restored sites, most species, if they're in the local area, they recolonize very quickly. Just want to mention a couple of things quickly. The full inventory in warm, unexplored areas benefits from using a set of collecting methods like hand netting, Malay trapping, and night trapping, which was done in Brazil. And using those three methods, they found many more species than they did with just hand netting. But obviously, the hotter zones have more twilight species and nighttime species than in the cold area. Now, the systematic sampling is best. Now, Martin talked about this at length, and I absolutely agree with him. It is the best, but it's not always the most practical. You've either got to cut down the number of species you're monitoring, or you cut down the number of sites when you're getting a lot of people involved. And I just mentioned that now algorithms are available for opportunistic sampling, particularly over time, is leading to valuable results. Talking of collecting, there's been a push in Angola, sampling Angola recently. And if you look at the picture on the right there, levels of endemism, those two spots in Angola there, you would not have been on the map 10 years ago because we didn't know. It was a terra incognita, as dragonflies go. But Jens Kipping and his colleagues have been doing much searching in that area, and now we have these extra endemic hotspots. I just want to mention that we've been doing thermal imaging, and this extraordinary damselfly, Spesbona angusta, it rapidly changes color in both sexes with changing temperatures as passing cloud. When a cloud goes over, both males and females go brown, and when the sun comes out, they go blue again. It's extremely localized, very rare. And we've done thermal imagery, and you can see the red dots are basically between the green and the orange. It likes those intermediate temperatures. I just want to mention some work done again by Rasim Khalifa using high-speed video for population assessment. We all know how difficult it is to mark release but then recapture. But if you can photograph them with high-speed video, then it solves a lot of problems. Now, exuviae counts, of course, are best for Oxygastra cortesi, as shown by Jürgen Ott in Germany. But we can't use exuviae much in South Africa because we're not quite sure where they go, whether it's ants are taking them or lizards. But if you just sample exuviae at a site, you'll never get more than 10% of the species. I mean, we don't have Oxygastra cortesia. I'm just speaking in general. I just want to mention quickly higher taxon invertebrate groups. We've done a comparison of using macroinvertebrate indicators. But the point is, species differences conflated into one index. It's a coarse assessment, lacking sensitivity, and it's mostly for running water. But dragonfly assemblages, of course, we're working at the species level, and it can include species relative abundance too. So finding those at a greater sensitivity. And but there are still options to include selected complementary taxa such as fish and then the Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera and Trichoptera. Just this very briefly, some of the complementary groups you can see Odonatus trichoptera there, Synaglionidae, and there's more Trichoptera. In our part of the world, Odonatum water beetles worked well together. Odonatum water beetles, aquatic macrophytes, and so on. But even in Brazil, they're getting different results. Looking at Odonar from EPT, depending on where in Brazil they did it. Now, we've done a detailed study on that, and there's extremely good high congruency between dragonflies and EPT. That was relative to river condition. So, in other words, if you're doing well with dragonfly conservation, you're doing pretty well with mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. Just to finish up, this is my son did an AI, did this a year ago, and he looked at it and he said, "Oh my goodness, you should be using Grok now. That's now hopelessly out of date." It's only a year old, that picture, but we didn't put in the that it should be the present day, so it seems to put pterodactyls up in the sky there. But notice how similar AI interpret the conservation journal Sentinels, Freshwater Conservation, as we did. Now, when it comes to the positive feedback and human well-being, that connection to nature improves. It's what the sociologists are telling us. Improvement in human cognition, social skills, physical and mental health, psychological connection to nature, greater care for nature, therefore improvement in nature conservation. And the Nature Futures framework of the IPBES brings in intrinsic value, which is great. That's partly because it's not just the value per se, but there's much more emphasis on interactions between species, not species as items. So that, I think, is a very significant part of what we do in dragonfly conservation. There's obviously got to be the food available at their habitats. So if we restore habitats, the food's got to be available as well. And then obviously there's instrumental value. In our case, we use the dragonflies for monitoring, and then there's relational value, nature as culture. So dragonfly conservation, we mentioned this intrinsic value, and employing dragonfly assemblages for freshwater assessment and monitoring. So there's their instrumental value. It doesn't exclude other taxa. We know plants and the conditions of the environment are important, other microenvironment, and then obviously citizen science, education, and outreach are important. And just to end up, biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation go hand in hand, with dragonflies as sentinels playing a major role. Well, thank you very much.